Hi, I'm Sebastian Courier, the artist in residence here at the Institute, and I'm very, very pleased today for Artists Present, this Artists Present series, to have A.M. Holmes here to read for us and talk with us. She's one of the most celebrated writers of her generation. She's written 6 novels, 2 collections of short stories, a best-selling memoir, The Mistress's Daughter, which I'm sure some of you know. She's been translated into 22 languages, worked in TV, had a film made of Safety of Objects, one of her collections of short stories, and also worked on The L Word, as I think as a writer and a producer. And she's received countless awards, as you can imagine, Guggenheim's and Endowment for the National Endowment for the Arts, and so on. So I'm very, very pleased to have you here. Welcome her, please.
Thank you very much. I'm super happy to be here. And Sebastian is an old friend of mine from Yaddo, the artist colony in upstate New York, where if you're not already, haven't applied, I urge you to apply. It's like just being in another world. And it's just such a treat because these are also Ellsworth Kelly's prints, and he's a friend who I've also written about a bunch. So I think I'm a writer who does a lot of things, whether it's working in TV or writing about art or teaching. And in my teaching, I'm more focused on creativity and teaching people how to sort of use their imaginations. And as you know, we always have these students who they're really good test takers. But when you ask them to just make something up, it's almost like they don't know what you're talking about. So I have a lot of fun. The book that I'm going to read to you from, May We Be Forgiven, started as an accident. I blame this book on Zadie Smith because she called and said she was doing an anthology, a benefit for schools or something, and would I please come up with something that was about 2 characters? And I thought, Angry Brothers. There's Angry Birds, the game, but I was like, Angry Brothers. It's more literary now. It was before Angry Birds. But I was interested always in the relationship between brothers, and I started writing, and then the thing was due, and I was not finished, and then years passed, and I was still writing. And I kept thinking, why is this taking so long? And it was like a 750-page manuscript by the time I finished. So the couple things I'll tell you about it is it's about these 2 brothers, and I'm just going to read you from the beginning. And one of them, oddly, is a Nixon scholar, which was another thread that went through that. And people said, why did you do that? And including my mother, who was quite upset by it. And I think that I grew up just outside of Washington, D.C., in Chevy Chase, where we had neighbors who all had diplomatic immunity, and their children would steal your bicycles, but you couldn't get them back because you weren't allowed to, and the police would say, we can't go in that driveway. So it was a very surrealistic childhood. And Nixon, the Watergate hearings was the first televised hearings, and that was right as I was sort of an adolescent and coming into my own sort of moral compass. And I think I've always been fascinated by how he in some ways inspired presidents that followed him with his idea, if the president does it, it's not illegal. So I was interested in that, and interested in the way also that the Nixon archive and history continues to unfold, in the way every couple of years now we still have materials that were seized, the special papers and things that are still being released. So I think I'm fascinated by, I guess, how that history continues to evolve, which won't play out in this part, but it's just a thread that may be of interest to some of you. Okay, so from the beginning of this, and this is a kind of a compressed version from the beginning. May we be forgiven. An incantation, a prayer, the hope that somehow I come out of this alive. Was there ever a time you thought, I'm doing this on purpose, I'm screwing up, and I don't know why? Do you want my recipe for disaster? The warning sign. Last year, Thanksgiving at their house, 20 or 30 people at tables spreading from the dining room into the living room, stopping abruptly at the piano bench. He was at the head of the table, picking turkey out of his teeth, talking about himself. I kept watching him as I went back and forth carrying plates into the kitchen, the edges of my fingers dipping into unnameable goo, cranberry sauce, sweet potato, cold pearl onion, gristle. With every trip back and forth from the dining room to the kitchen, I hated him more. Every sin of our childhood, beginning with his birth, came back. He entered the world 11 months after me, sickly at first, not enough oxygen along the way, and was given far too much attention. And then, despite what I repeatedly tried to tell him about how horrible he was, he acted as though he believed he was a gift of the gods. They named him George. Geo, he liked to be called, like that was something cool, something scientific, mathematical, analytical. Geode, I called him, like a sedimentary rock. By the time we were 10 and 11, he was taller than me, broader, stronger. "You sure he's not the butcher's boy?" my father would ask jokingly, and no one laughed. I was bringing heavy plates and platters, casseroles caked with the debris of dinner, and no one noticed that help was needed. Not George, not his 2 children, not his ridiculous friends, not my Chinese-American wife Claire, who hated turkey and never failed to remind us that her family celebrated with roast duck and sticky rice. George's wife Jane had been at it all day, cooking, cleaning, serving, and was now scraping bones into a giant trash bin. Jane scoured the plates, piling dirty dishes one on top of the other, and dropping the slimy silver into a sink. Glancing at me, she brushed her hair away with the back of her hand and smiled. I went back for more. I looked at their children and imagined them dressed as pilgrims in black pilgrim buckle shoes and doing pilgrim children chores, carrying buckets of milk like human oxen. Nathaniel, 12, and Ashley, 11, sat like lumps at the table, hunched, or more like curled, as if poured into their chairs, truly spineless, eyes focused on their small screens, the only thing in motion, their thumbs. One texting friends no one had ever seen, the other killing digitized terrorists. In the background, 2 televisions loudly competed among themselves for no one's attention. "I'm a company man, heart and soul," George says, "the network's president of entertainment. I am ever aware, 24/7. There's a television in every room. The fact is, George can't bear to be alone. The turkey platters at the center of the table. I reached over my wife's shoulder and lifted. The tray was heavy and wobbled. I willed myself to stay strong and was able to carry out the mission while balancing a casserole of Brussels sprouts and bacon in the crook of my other arm. The turkey, an heirloom bird, whatever that means, had been rubbed, relaxed, and herbed into submission, into thinking it wasn't so bad to be decapitated and stuffed up the ass with breadcrumbs and cranberries in some annual rite. The bird had been raised with a goal in mind, an actual date when his number would come up. I stood in the kitchen picking at the carcass while Jane did the dishes, bright blue gloves on, up to her elbows in suds. My fingers were deep in the bird, the hollow body still warm, the best bits of stuffing packed in. I dug with my moist, greasy fingers, curled into what would have been a turkey's G-spot if they had such a thing. Jane looked at me, my mouth moist and greasy. She lifted her hands out of the water and came towards me to plant one on me. Not friendly. The kiss was serious, full of desire. It was terrifying and unexpected. She did it, then snapped off her gloves and walked out of the room. I was holding the counter, gripping it with greasy fingers. Dessert was served. Jane asked if anyone wanted coffee and went back into the kitchen. I followed her like a dog wanting more. She ignored me. "Are you ignoring me?" She said nothing and handed me the coffee. "Could you let me have a little pleasure, a little something that's just for myself?" She paused. "Cream and sugar?" From Thanksgiving through Christmas and on into the New Year, all I thought of was George fucking Jane. George on top of her, or for special occasion, George on the bottom. And once, fantastically, George having her from the back, his eyes fixed on the wall-mounted television, the ticker tape of news headlines trickling across the bottom of the screen. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was convinced that despite his charms, his excess of professional achievement, George wasn't very good in bed, and that all he knew about sex he learned from the pages of a magazine read furtively while shitting. It just, there's so much that I won't read to you, but there, not just there, but throughout. Anyway, back to the more literary parts. It's almost 8 o'clock on an evening towards the end of February when Jane calls. Claire is still at the office. She's always at the office. Another man would think his wife was having an affair. I just think Claire is smart. "I need your help," Jane says. "Don't worry," I say before I even know what the worry is. I imagine her calling me from the kitchen phone, the long curly cord wrapping around her body. "He's at the police station," she says. "Did he do something wrong?" "Apparently," she says, "they want me to come get him. Can you go pick your brother up?" "Don't worry," I say, repeating myself. Within minutes, I'm en route from Manhattan to the Westchester hamlet they call home. A fight. On the way to the police station, that's what I'm thinking. George has it in him, a kind of anatomic reactivity that stays under the surface till something triggers him and he erupts, throwing over a table, smashing his fist through a wall. More than once, I've been the recipient of his frustration, a baseball hurled at my back, striking me at kidney level and dropping me to my knees. I imagine he went out for a drink after work and got on the wrong side of someone. 30 minutes later, I park outside the small suburban police station, a white cake box circa 1970. "I'm here on behalf of George Silver." "You're the brother?" "Yes. We called his wife. She's coming to get him." "She called me, so I'm picking him up." We wanted to take him to the hospital, they say, but he wouldn't go. He kept repeating, he's a dangerous man and we should take him downtown and lock him up. Personally, I think the man needs a doctor. You don't walk away from something like that unscathed. So he got into a fight? Car accident, the cop says, bad one. Doesn't appear he was under the influence, passed a breath test and consented to urine. He really should see a doctor. Was it his fault? He ran a red light, plowed into a minivan. The husband was killed on impact. The wife was alive at the scene in the back seat next to the surviving boy. Rescue crews used the jaws of life, and when she was released, she expired. Her legs fell out of the car. Someone yells from the back office. The boy will survive. Your brother's in back, I'll get him. Is he being charged with the crime? Not at the moment. There'll be a full investigation. Officers noted that he appeared disoriented at the scene. Take him home. Get him a doctor, a lawyer. These things can get ugly. George comes out disheveled. Why are you here? He asks me. Jane called, and besides, you had the car. She could have taken a taxi. It's late. I lead George through the small parking lot and into the night, feeling compelled to take him by the arm, to guide him by the elbow, not sure if I'm preventing him from escaping or just steadying him. Either way, George doesn't pull away. He lets himself be led. Where's Jane? At the house, I say. Does she know? I shake my head, no. It was awful, he says. There was a light. Did you see the light? I think maybe I saw it. I don't know. It didn't make sense. Like it didn't apply to you? Like I didn't know. He gets into the car. Where's Jane? He asks again. At the house, I repeat. Buckle your belt. Pulling into the driveway, the headlights cut through the house and catch Jane in the kitchen holding a pot of coffee. Are you all right? She asks when we're inside. How could I be? George says. He empties his pockets onto the kitchen counter, takes off his shoes, socks, pants, boxers, jacket, undershirt, stuffs all of it into the kitchen trash can. Would you like some coffee? Jane asks. Naked, George stands with his head tilted as if he's hearing something. Coffee? She asks again, gesturing with the pot. He doesn't answer. He walks from the kitchen through the dining room and into the living room and sits in the dark, naked, in a chair. Did he get into a fight? Jane asks. Car accident. You better call your insurance company and your lawyer. Do you have a lawyer? George, do we have a lawyer? Do I need one, he asks. If I do, call Rutkowski. Something's wrong with him, Jane says. He killed people. There's a pause. She pours George a cup of coffee and brings it into the living room along with a dish towel that she drapes over his genitals like putting a napkin in his lap. The phone rings. Don't answer it, George says. Hello, Jane says. I'm sorry, he's not home right now. May I take a message? Yes, I hear you. Perfectly clear, she says and hangs up. Do you want a drink? She asks no one in particular, pouring one for herself. Who was it? I ask. Friend of the family, she says, and clearly she means the family that was killed. For a long time he sits in the chair, the dish towel shielding his privates, the cup of coffee daintily on his lap. Beneath him, a puddle forms. George, Jane implores when she hears what sounds like water dripping. You're having an accident. Tessie, the old dog, gets up from her bed and comes over and sniffs. Jane hurries into the kitchen and comes back with a wad of paper towels. It'll eat the finish right off the floor, she says. Through it all, George looks blank, like the empty husk left by a reptile who has shed his skin. Jane takes the coffee cup from George and hands it to me. She takes the wet kitchen towel from his lap, helps him to stand, wipes the back of his legs and his ass with paper towels. Let me help you upstairs. I watch as they climb the steps. I see my brother's body slack, his stomach sagging slightly, the bones of his hips, his pelvis, his flat ass, all so white they appear to glow in the dark. As they climb, I see below his axe and tucked between his legs, low purplish-pink nutsack swaying like an old lion. I sit on their couch. Where's my wife? Isn't Claire curious to know what happened? Doesn't she wonder why I'm not home? The room smells like urine. The wet paper towels are on the floor. Jane doesn't come back to clean up. I do it, then sit back on the sofa. I'm staring through the dark at an old wooden tribal mask made with hemp hair and a feather and laced with tribal beads. I'm staring at this unfamiliar face their son Nate brought back from a school trip to South Africa, and the mask seems to be staring back as though inhabited, wanting to say something, taunting me with its silence. I hate this living room. I hate this house. I want to go home. I text Claire and explain what happened. She writes back, I took advantage of your being gone and I'm still at the office. I dutifully sleep on the sofa with a small, smelly blanket covering my shoulders. Tessie, the dog, joins me, warming my feet. In the morning, there are hurried phone calls and hushed conversations. A copy of the accident report crawls out of the fax machine. George, Jane says clearly, we have to go to the hospital. Pack your bag, and he does. I drive them. He sits next to me wearing well-worn corduroy pants, a flannel shirt he's had for years. He's unevenly shaved. I drive self-consciously, worried his complacent mood might shift. He might flash back, erupt, and try to grab the wheel. The seatbelts are good. They discourage sudden movements. Simple Simon met a pieman going to the fair. Said Simple Simon to the pieman, let me taste your wares, George intones. Simple Simon went a-fishing for to catch a whale. All the water he had got was in his mother's pail. Watch out, he says to me, or you'll get what you asked for. In the emergency room, Jane goes to the counter with her insurance information, the police report, and explains her husband was involved in an accident. We wait. Do you know why you're here? The emergency room doctor asks him. I've got bad aim, George says. And then it skips forward a little bit. Or it doesn't, I do. Part you can read at home. It's funny how quickly something becomes a routine, a way of doing business. I stay with Jane, and it's as though we're playing house. I take out the trash, lock the door, and she makes a snack and asks if I'll come upstairs. We watch a little television and read. I reread whatever it was George had been reading, his newspapers and magazines, the big history of Thomas Jefferson that sits beside the bed. The accident happens, and then it happens. It doesn't happen the night of the accident or the night we all visit. It happens the night after that. The night after Claire tells me not to leave Jane alone. The night after my wife Claire leaves for China. Claire goes on her trip, George goes downhill, and then it happens. It's the thing that's not supposed to happen. The evening visit to the hospital goes badly. For reasons that are not clear, George is locked in a padded room, his arms bound to his body. Jane and I take turns peering through the small window. He looks miserable. Jane asks to go in and see him, and the nurse cautions her against it, but she insists. Jane goes to him, calls his name. George looks up at her, and then turns on her, pins her body and bites her again and again, her face, her neck, her hands, breaking the skin. The aides rush in and pull him off her, and Jane is taken downstairs. Her wounds are clean and dressed, and she's given some kind of a shot, like a rabies vaccination. We go back to the house, and Jane heats 100-calorie brownies in the microwave, and I scoop non-fat ice cream on them. She sprays them with 0-calorie whipped cream, and I cheer them further with chocolate sprinkles. We snack in silence. I take out the trash and change out of my clothes, the same clothes I've been wearing for days, and put on a pair of George's pajamas. I hug her. I want to be comforting. I'm in his pajamas. She's still dressed. I don't think anything will happen. I apologize, I say, without knowing what I'm saying, and then she's against me. She puts her hands on the side of her skirt and slides it down. She pulls me towards her. I'm skipping ahead again. You know what happens. The hospital lets him out, or more likely, he simply decides to leave. Inexplicably, he's able to walk out unnoticed in the middle of the night. George comes home in a taxi using money he's found at the bottom of his pocket. He can't find his keys, so he rings the bell and the dog barks. Maybe I heard that part, the dog barking. Or maybe he didn't ring the bell, and maybe the dog didn't bark. Maybe George took the spare key from inside the fake rock in the garden by the door, and like an intruder, came silently into his own house. Maybe he came upstairs thinking he'd crawl into his bed, but his spot was taken. I don't know how long he stood there. I don't know how long he waited before he lifted the lamp from her side of the bed and smashed it onto Jane's head. That's when I woke up. She's screaming. The one blow isn't enough. She tries to get up. The lamp isn't even broken. George looks at me and then picks up the lamp again and swings it at her. The porcelain vase that is the base explodes against Jane's head, and by then I'm out of bed. He tosses aside what remains of the lamp, blood streaming down his fingers, picks up the phone and throws it to me. Call it in, he says. And I think I'll stop there. There's plenty more to read, and I happily read the rest to you, but and I'm happy to answer any questions about my odd imagination. I think one of the things just to say is, and this comes up so often, and it seems so obvious, but whenever I'm on book tour, people say, like, do you write fiction or nonfiction? I'm thinking, or is your novel fiction or nonfiction? I'm like, it's fiction. And I feel like in some ways we've lost track of that, but I really am, except when particularly setting out to write something that is memoir, I really am a fiction writer, and I take enormous pleasure in inhabiting people who are very different from myself. I mean, it sounds odd to say that one takes a lot of pleasure in inhabiting a crazy pair of brothers, but it's so interesting to me always to be able to take on not just the personality, but the experience and the socio-economic world and the history of other people and move through the world in their skins. People are always baffled, like, well, you're a woman and you write as a man. I think that's so much easier to do than to write as a woman. There's nothing for me harder than writing as sort of a, middle-aged-ish woman, I go, oh, God, I already know what that's like. Why bother? No, I mean, it's a different world for me. So I always think that, I don't know, it's interesting, because I think a lot of people either work much more closely from their experience, or, I don't know, I love, it's like time travel. So, does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Right. I feel like I'd run out really quick. I don't know that much. And I'm really interested, as you can probably tell, I'm super fascinated by human behavior and by why people do what they do and what compels them. A few years ago, I wrote a novel that was banned in many places called The End of Alice. It was about a jailed pedophile murderer. And it was the hardest thing I've ever had to write, but it's actually now used to teach therapists how to deal with pedophiles, because there's not that much written from the pedophile's point of view, which is awful. But it was so interesting, because I was interested in writing about, weirdly, morality. And I thought, who's the last person to talk about morality? I thought, a jailed pedophile. And one of the things he sort of says that's really upsetting to the readers, basically, if I'm in jail, why is it still happening? And it was, for me, really a way of talking about how, as a society, we don't deal with that very well. But a lot of publishers turned it down. They were afraid to publish it. And then when I went to even talk to publishers in this country, it was very funny, because they would say, you seem awfully normal. And I was like, I am. And I think they were worried that somehow it was a personal experience and they'd send me out on the road and I would, crack. But it's interesting, and it took, in some countries, in France, it was actually in galleys, and they withdrew it, which is fascinating, because, France published Lolita first, and they were scared to publish it. It took 17 years before they published it. It finally came out last year. So, yeah. Did I talk to people in jail? Yeah, I mean, I weirdly, when I went to college, I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, I went to a lot of different colleges, but I took a course in prison survival at American University. Yeah, and it was mostly for graduate students and prison guards, and it was taught at 6:30 in the morning so that people could take it before work. And I actually have this cousin who's now in charge of all of the discipline in the federal prison system. She was also taking the class. They call her the Black Widow. She's like, if you don't like your bread, you write the Black Widow a letter, and she, like, I don't know, gives you less bread. But it was fascinating, because it was all about what happens to a person in jail and the dehumanization, and looked at concentration camps and jails and just different places where people lose their sense of self. And I weirdly wrote a paper comparing death row to Kubler-Ross's Death and Dying, and saying that it was unconstitutional because, in effect, the person died multiple times. And the professor loved the paper and asked if he could use it. Exactly. I was like, yeah. So he appropriated pieces of it. Sort of a joke, but not really. But anyway, so I've been all that to say, I think that the notions of prison had always interested me a lot. And then I went and studied literally like prison architecture, and how the first prison in the United States, Eastern State Penitentiary, which is a super cool art project now in Philadelphia, was based on this idea of doing penance. So every room, every cell had sky, because you were supposed to basically pray all day. And when they would move prisoners from cell to cell, you never saw who they were, because you weren't supposed to reveal their identity. They were just supposed to do penance. It was fascinating. I learned tons of stuff. So yeah, I did talk to, scary people. And then they write me letters saying we have things in common. I'm like, no, we really don't. Yeah.
Before you wrote End of Alice,
Yeah.
I read actually, did you talk to a pedophile in jail? Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of research, and there was a point where I was doing all this research, and I actually was, when I was talking to, actually, funny enough today, to students, but I had hundreds of pages of notes, and I thought, you have to stop doing research and start writing, because you're not writing about an idea. You have to create a person who is going to be this person. And the guy I created is he's a very smart and peculiar guy who, in the course of the book, as he realizes really what he's done and becomes more horrified by it, he loses his mind. So it was a very hard thing to realize, on the one hand, someone coming to consciousness and simultaneously finding it unbearable and going insane. As the sort of, that took an extra year. It was like in the old ho-hos, like the layers of like the chocolate and whatever. I thought it took an extra year just to get that wound around right. So, yeah.
In this book, I haven't read your others, but I was wondering if it was a sort of a measured decision to tell the whole story through Harold's voice, and what is gained and lost when you choose that voice.
As opposed to telling it through other people's voices or variety?
Omniscient drop in, or all the other
Right. You know, it's interesting because isn't it sort of I was supposed to say I should know my book. Isn't it, it's a little bit distant third, well, it's third and first. No, I think in this case, I wanted him to own the story. And I think what's interesting about this, I call this book a midlife coming of age book, because Harold is this guy who's been waiting for his life to begin. And he's a total, kind of a failure as a Nixon scholar as well. He loses his job. He's fired because the school where he teaches is no longer interested in history. They think that history is more future forward these days, which again was like a big joke in the book, and people didn't seem to always get it, that you could be fired because history wasn't important. Anyway, so I think I wanted him to sort of be at the center of the story, and it's obviously very much about the brothers, but also Harold steps in and becomes the parent to these children. And he actually is a really good parent. So you see how he kind of grows up through the course of this book. So yeah, that wasn't a hard decision. I think it's always the interesting thing is, and other people here are writers probably know this too, it's always so much about the tone or the intonation. And it is a little bit like a musical thing. You have to hit that tone right from the very beginning, and then it goes from there. And if you don't, you struggle for months or years, or it just doesn't work till you get it. Sebastian, yeah. Yeah.
It struck me that because he changes, the very tone of the writing changes over time.
Yeah.
You were looking to do something like that.
Yeah.
Because you very much felt that in terms of the overall flow.
Yeah, it's funny how, I'm always trying to find other forms to talk about writing with, like music or architecture, of like, how did you build it? How did you, yeah. You had a question.
Consciously write in terms of theme or level of writing to a particular audience?
Definitely never to a particular audience. But I think I weirdly write fiction that's about ideas. So I'll have what I think of as sort of a bunch of nonfiction ideas, like Richard Nixon, like, secrets, like the kind of Cain and Abel competitiveness between brothers and in a family. But I won't, and then from those ideas, I let the characters sort of grow and tell the story. Yeah. They kind of inhabit it, yeah.
I'm not sure that answers the question in terms of who are likely to be the readers.
Oh, the truth is, I think more about being accurate with my characters. I had a wonderful teacher, the writer Grace Paley, and Grace used to talk about truth according to the character, and that for me is incredibly liberating, because it's not about what I think about or what my political point of view is. It's about who is this person in the story. And so I think more about getting that right than who's going to be the person to read it. Because I feel like in some ways I don't, especially with publishing, honestly being what it is now, I don't have a lot of control over who's going to read it. Although I have to say, I love, it's been enormously important to me the way the books have been translated into so many other languages, because it means I think of myself as a very American writer, for better and worse simultaneously. And to know that the books have resonance, like, they just sent me the Serbian cover the other day, or in Korea, the book before this had sort of donuts as a theme, and they called and said, could we please put a Dunkin' Donut coupon in your book? And my literary agents, absolutely not, we don't do things like that, we never would do that. And I said, let them put a Dunkin' Donut coupon in the book. How crazy is that in Korea, there's a Dunkin' Donut coupon on the back of like a literary novel? So you take it in and be like, I'll have a donut and I don't know, So that to me, that it carries into other cultures, means a lot. But I don't think about the reader, except in Korea, where I want them to have a free donut with the book and get high, on the sugar. Yeah.
I was just, one thing that quite fascinated me, which I was reminded of when you read the beginning of the book, is how much you want the very dramatic trauma of the beginning to play out in the rest of the book. Because
Yeah.
on one level, there's this explosion, and it's largely directed on these odd appearances of George, who inject some of the drama back in him. And I sort of feel that perhaps a memory of that and the unresolvedness of that, you're never really forgiven.
Right, right.
Plays out. But then there's another theme that I thought, I just thought of it coming to your talk. What provides a kind of stabilizing ritual throughout is eating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
exactly,
that
yeah.
seems to be
Yeah.
almost the most consistent theme
Yes.
of the book.
Yeah.
That everything occurs, that is, it keeps on referring to different meals. And
Yeah.
It begins and ends with a Thanksgiving.
Exactly, yeah.
I just wondered whether you had any comments on that.
No, it's funny, people have noticed that, and I can't decide if I'm just like, I don't know, have like an eating disorder that like seeps into the fiction sometimes. I mean, I think it is, we talk always about breaking bread, and it's very much a book about family, and that is one of the ways that families organize themselves. But there's a lot of detail about eating. I don't have a great explanation for it. Somebody once also sent me an email a long time ago, and they went through and they counted like the number of fires in my books, and the amount of Valium that was taken, the Diet Coke that was consumed, and there were certain things that were very high recurrences. I don't know, I must have been starving, is all I can say,
The reason I asked the two questions in
Yeah.
conjunction with the book was it seems to me the rituals of eating, as a sort of Dissonance theme, are quite at odds with the kind of trauma
Right.
of the eating, and this sense of there being some darker force which comes up from time to time, which erupts, in his indigestion.
Right, absolutely, right, exactly, there's a whole, exactly.
I'm wondering how you see these two kind of balanced off against one another, or whether you did see it.
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question in terms of the balance, and I think, one of the things I'm also always writing about is the split between our public and private selves, and how on the one hand we work so hard to sort of make a self that we take out into the world, and yet most of us have a whole other life or world happening inside, and then now, and it's a little bit in this book too, in our cyber lives, people have these, avatars that they're online with and they're chatting as, and there's a kind of almost, disassociation or schizophrenia about that. So I think those kinds of dissonances interest me a lot, and the way in which you can have all this sort of very ritualized family behavior, and at the same time, this incredible trauma and violence. And in the book, it sort of comes out that George's children have actually been sent away to schools because George's personality is very erratic, and that the mother didn't think really that the house was a safe place for them. The thing I find also, like talking about dissonance, so this book won it used to be called the Orange Prize and is now called the Bailey's Women's Prize in London. So it's a prize, an international literary prize for a woman writer, and I thought, this is the least likely book to win that prize. A book in which a woman is murdered, in the first 20 pages, and that's really about just this incredible kind of, that the relationship between the two brothers trumps the marriage, the wife, anything. They just clunk her on the head and she's out. And I thought, how does it win that prize? Because it shouldn't, in my mind, in some ways. So I think that it's funny because that kind of irony or dissonance is all through my work. And it always has been. People always say, she's this incredibly controversial writer, and then it'll be like, her books are on the best books for the teenage. Or, the same book will be like one of the 100 most banned books and on the library list of what you're supposed to read. I think that literally probably in my mind, and maybe whatever, I think it means I'm doing something right, that I'm able to sort of hit those things simultaneously. And then people will say, you're doing it just to provoke us. And I think, I'm not, but if it does provoke you, that means I've touched a nerve, which means there's something accurate in there, that I'm actually getting at something that we don't really want to talk about. On the other hand, we want to sit home privately and just read it, and then pretend we didn't, I think it's complicated, which is to me, that's like the best part of writing fiction, is that you can get all that in there. And it can be, like some people will say, are you trying to be sarcastic or are you being serious? And I think, well, both are sort of true. I'm both making fun of who we are, and at the same time, I'm deadly serious about it, which can be difficult for people, and for critics sometimes a lot. Yeah.
I can see it's extremely kind of liberating to go into kind of these characters where you can use your fantasy, but how do you deal with kind of limitations, boundaries? So
What boundaries?
there must be, right?
No, there are boundaries. I think what's interesting is,
You
and this,
mentioned something like being kind of consistent or something
Right.
in terms of their own world.
absolutely.
But how do you?
Well, I think it goes back even to what you're asking me a little bit. So on the one hand, I think this book to me is very, as someone was saying earlier about John Cheever's work, this book is, in many ways, it's an entirely traditional book. There's nothing about the narrative or the structure that's avant-garde or anything like that. On the other hand, it does all these things, and it sort of literally tests the bounds of reality and plausibility and all that. And sometimes I write what I would call like emotional science fiction, where it goes just to the edge of what we think can be real. But I think I always stay within the framework of the familiar in terms of what we expect from novels and the way we expect them to work. So I hold that boundary together and go crazy within that. And people can tolerate that. I think it gets really scary for people if you smash too many things at once. And it's not like I set out to smash it, but I also, the truth is, I don't want to read a book if it's just a document of everyday life. I always think, and I tell my students, why should I stop doing what I'm doing to come read your story? And you better have a good reason. And they're like, oh, you know.
You feel you're close to an edge, but it sort of means there's something there where you're.
I don't even think at this point I'm the one close to the edge. I think there's other people who are closer to an edge. You know, because you get to a certain point where you've been doing it for a while and you're not that close to the edge. Me, I don't think.
But what about the end of Alice?
The end of Alice was close to an edge. Yeah. The end of Alice was close to an edge.
When you were doing that, right? I mean, I'm so intrigued by this whole book because you were still in
Yeah.
the beginning of your.
I was, and it's funny because the book I'd written before that, I wrote a novel called In a Country of Mothers, which was the only book I ever wrote as a piece of fiction that was a little bit autobiographical. And it's a story, I'm adopted, and it's a story about a woman who has a child, gives it up for adoption, becomes a therapist, has a whole other family, and gets this patient that she decides is the girl and drives this girl crazy. And I actually thought I did a bad job writing that book. And I felt like the reason and no one else said that, the critics didn't say it, but I personally felt like I cheated the material, that I didn't really understand well enough the girl and whatever. So the next book, The End of Alice, I made this pact with myself that no matter what came up, I would not run away from it. And it was awful. I mean, it's a really brutal book that really pushes at the boundaries of, as a reader, what you can tolerate and the sexuality and not just in terms of sexual abuse of children, but this guy's sort of sexual imagination and what he provokes in the reader. It's dark. And yet I also thought intellectually and creatively it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and in some ways the best thing I'd ever done, although I think this one turned out okay. But that's, you know, however many years later. So I think in that sense, I knew the boundary was there. And I was a little scared, honestly, when you think about, you know, what's out there in the world. And I was sure that it would get banned in this country, and weirdly it didn't. But I would go and give these readings, and a lot of weird people would show up, which is also really not my thing. And sometimes they would just they look at you, like as though it's so creepy, it's just not even funny. And then one of them, they said, we've had a threat that they're gonna disrupt your reading tonight. I'm like, who, what? And the whole time you're reading, you're thinking like, am I gonna have to duck? Is someone gonna like shoot at me? You know, you get mail from prisoners and they go, oh, we sent this to your publisher, and they sent it back and gave us your home address. And you know, just like crazy stuff. But I feel like the piece of it still was, I did a good job representing that character. And I feel like it provoked a lot of outrage in people. But the fact is, it's interesting to me that it's, you know, so now it's like 18 years later, that conversation about sexual abuse, whether in a church or in a, you know, wherever, is still happening. And the idea of how we deal with it as a society, or how we, you know, I don't know, punish, remediate, deal with people before they become sexual abusers, we don't do a very good job. It's still front page news all over the world. So it's interesting that that book is still, it's like the Jimi Hendrix of novels. It's still as edgy now as, like, you know, when you put on like Purple Haze and you go, oh my God, that's incredible, you know? So I wish I could do that. I'd like to do that again, but not in that same subject area, you know? Yeah.
Critic in Proof refers to the book as being the divided heart of human consciousness. Do you agree? What does that mean?
I just think it means that we're all more complex. You know, that people are not one note, and that people have contradictions and layers, and you know, it's also the thing people go like, how can you write such an evil person? I think, how can you pretend that everyone doesn't have some piece of that in them, some piece of darkness or violence, or, you know how, and this sounds awful too, and just risk it all. But you know how there'll be these things where, like, remember Andrea Yates, who like killed her whole family? And people go, I don't understand how somebody can do that. I think, how can you not understand how somebody can do that? How can you not understand those human impulses and that darkness? And for me, I think I'm always trying to help explain that, or bridge that gap, or help reconcile that, how we can both love ourselves and have such incredible self-loathing simultaneously. I mean, that's part of the whole may we be forgiven. It's a big idea, you know. And I think in a weird way, I'm like this peculiarly, even though I write about these extreme subjects, there are these like peculiarly moral books. It's always got this like really moral thing, which is probably so old-fashioned and beyond, like, you know, it's the opposite of transgressive. It's the, you know, the far other extreme. So, yeah.
Somebody else?
No, it's your turn.
I was sort of pursuing the question over there about, you know, getting all the tumult out.
Yeah.
And then letting it flow. Is
No, it just kept, it's a really long book, and it just, the story, I think the other thing that's interesting is you point out, so in the very beginning of it, Jane is essentially murdered, she's brain dead, and she ultimately dies. And it was started, again, I started as a short story, and the problem is you can't kill your main character 20 pages into your novel. That's not how you write a novel. So then I thought, like, what do I do? And it kept going, and there's that funny moment you think, why are you still writing that? And you're like, I don't know. And then you have this funny conversation with yourself, is that your next book? You're like, I don't know. And it's just still going, but you're clearly not done. And then the question for me becomes, how do you raise the stakes then? How do you make it interesting? How do you have it sustain itself? And so it became this kind of, interesting journey about family and George and Harold. And there's a few crazy things where George gets sent to this sort of high-end mental hospital, and then it gets closed to become an executive conference facility. So he's then entered into a program called the Woodsman, which is like where you're kind of tagged and set into the wild, and there's government cheese and lockers if you need it. And he partners with a guy who's a former used car salesman, Israeli arms dealer, and they, it just goes into crazy, crazy places that are just on the edge of what's real, and there's a sense of what kind of, prison programs do we have, and all kinds of things. And then, Harold is the Nixon scholar he ends up adopting the child that was the surviving child in the accident because George's children want him to, and he just takes on these children and this life, and he ends up on this, Nate, the boy in the book, decides he wants to have his bar mitzvah in South Africa, in the village where that mask has come from. And so they try to hire a party planner to plan a bar mitzvah in South Africa, and what does that mean? Because the local temple really doesn't want to have his bar mitzvah after all the, upset about the family. And so they go on this incredible trip with the adopted boy and the two kids to South Africa. And it's crazy. It's totally crazy. And then he wants to give his bar mitzvah money to this village that he visited as a student. And his fantasies, they'll dig a well or something, but what do they really want? They want a big TV. And that's true in the sense that we live in a world where we can't sort of escape ourselves, and we think we can have these great values of I want to put a well in, but they want to watch soccer. It's not like we can have fantasies of how other countries and cultures are different from ours, and then you're shocked to find that they're the same in pleasant and unpleasant ways. So I don't know. It's a travel log. Anyone else have a question? Yes.
It strikes me that your explicitness about bodily
Yeah.
function, not just sex,
Right.
but other bodily
Sure. It's right up there with the food, apparently. Yeah.
is one of the things that roots your stories in the real.
Yeah.
So that it involves the reader
Yeah.
from that perspective. Would you care to comment a little bit on that?
No, I'm just kidding. No. I do. I think it is. I mean, I think it is very much. And there's a part in here where Harold has basically a stroke while he's looking in the mirror, and it's all about, his body and stuff. I mean, I think I'm interested in the same way as in human behavior. I'm interested in how we inhabit ourselves and the failures of that, the physical failures of the body fascinate me. And I think in some ways that may be part of, I weirdly want to write a novel now about an ethicist, like a kind of crooked ethicist, or tormented ethicist, but I also think a lot about how hard it is to be human and to live in this body. And so I think I probably write a lot about that, between people snacking and taking Valium. I don't know. Anyone else have a question? Okay, two more. Yeah.
I just had a question about kind of your experience as a writer. You're a blessing in some way, person, racked up a lot of accolades over the
Yeah.
years. Has it changed your experience? Has it freed you to explore the kind of topics that maybe a first-time writer didn't have the publisher who was willing to put it on paper, or do you kind of miss the anonymity, or is it?
Well, I'm A.M. Holmes for a reason, so I'm just there's a whole other person named Amy Holmes, little Amy Holmes behind there, who lives a whole other life. So, I mean, I think the interesting thing is, although I've been writing since I was 19 years old, I had a play produced when I was 19. The accolades and whatever, I've written 10 books, so it's all been over time. And the funny thing is, and Grace Paley talked about this too, as a writer, and many of you know this in your work in science and music. You do something and people go, oh, that's great, but you're never like the CEO of writing. You're always thrown entirely back to the beginning, and you think, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to start this again. I don't know where this problem begins and ends. And you gain some mastery over certain skills. Like you like to think, oh, I'm better now at editing. Like to me, this novel is a novel that's actually written with the concision of a short story. It's a 700-page short story, and because it started that way, I had to keep that pace up. And that to me was a really, like as a writer, a really interesting thing to try to figure out. But you always are completely back to the beginning, which is just god awful. And so no, it doesn't change anything. And publishing being so weird right now, I think, in fact, with this book, publishing was so bad, I actually thought the one thing about this that's truly liberating was I thought, I'm just going to write a book that I want to read. Which it goes to that question actually about the reader, but I don't usually do that. I usually much more edit myself, and there's some of the, like the Woodsman section, a friend said you should take that out. I thought, I'm just leaving it in. I like it, which I never would. When I was a younger writer, I wouldn't. I would immediately have taken it out. And I thought, it's my book. And then I had the funny experience, which I've never had before, is I turned in this like 700-page book, and the editor said, I think you need to add more. I was like, what? And he said, because he was right, because near the end I had really compressed it. I was just like trying to get done, and it needed some other stuff. So and we added a couple really, really great sort of sections. But that was, I've never had, someone go, you need another 50 pages. I was like, all right. So, it's all a process. Do you have one last question?
Can I ask one last question? How would you, like to be, what kind of writer would you like to be remembered? Just curious about it, because you're
Well, first I just want to be remembered. That's the,
yeah, of course.
and from there I don't really care. I mean, you know what I mean? No, I think, I want, my whole idea is always, I want to write books that obviously that entertain people, but more importantly, make people think. Make people think about how they move through their lives, how they see themselves, how they relate to others. I'm very interested in our sort of level of responsibility in others. And this is going to sound again like so weird for a second, but I was home for 9/11. I lived in Greenwich Village looking at the World Trade Center. And it was the first day of my New York Public Library fellowship. And I was literally on my way out the door. I hadn't left the house probably in a couple of years. I mean, I don't go out to work, so I didn't even know how you go to work. I was like, I have a fellowship. What do I take? You take your desk? I didn't, it's like I was late because I just didn't even know how to get to the New York Public Library to start my fellowship. And the plane hit, and a friend called from St. Vincent's and said, look out the window, something happened. And then I saw the second plane, and that was the first time that my physical reality became, for lack of a better word, much more unstable than my intellectual reality. I depend on the world around me to stay in place so that I can go crazy, right? But then it went completely crazy. And it prompted me, the book that I wrote just before this was a book called This Book Will Save Your Life. And it was a lot of me thinking about how we're not just responsible for ourselves, we're responsible for each other. And that it's very often easier to do things for other people than for yourself. So I'm really interested in that. So that's sort of like social issues. So I think in a way, if you're asking like how I want to be remembered, I don't know, somebody who made us think and hopefully made us like push ourselves a little bit more. But I don't know. I know, yeah, writer with a mission. That's a terrible thing though, but it's just true. Thank you guys so much for coming on a weird night.